Numb. The arena lights can make any woman look untouchable, but they cannot protect her when the music stops. At 56, Mariah Carey still walks onto a stage, and the room instinctively leans forward because her voice is not merely famous, it is familiar, stitched into people's first loves, first heartbreaks, first holidays, and the private moments when they needed a song to do what words could not. Yet the most devastating chapters of her life have never happened under spotlights. They have happened in the hours when applause is gone, when the phone stops buzzing, when the mirrors stop reflecting a myth and start reflecting a person who has carried too much for too long. In recent years, the world watched her smile through events that would have broken most people in half, including the kind of loss that arrives not as a headline, but as a physical emptiness in the chest, the kind that makes a house feel too large and a piano feel like a stranger. Within a single weekend in 2024, Mariah lost both her mother and her sister, two lives that framed her origin story from opposite ends. One, the disciplined music teacher who taught her how to breathe through fear. The other, a complicated bond shadowed by pain, distance, and years that never truly healed. Imagine that for a moment, two doors closing almost back to back, two voices from childhood gone, and a woman whose entire identity is sound suddenly forced to sit inside a silence she cannot control. This is where the story becomes difficult to watch, because Mariah's life has always been a collision between brilliance and instability, between the public expectation of perfection and the private reality of survival. People love to describe her as a diva, a legend, a once-in-a-lifetime instrument, but those labels are too clean. They skip the most important detail, that her voice was born in an atmosphere of tension long before it became an industry product. She grew up learning how to read danger, how to disappear emotionally while still standing in the room, how to create a safe place out of melody when the world outside felt unpredictable. That kind of childhood does not vanish when success arrives. It follows you into every studio session, every relationship, every contract, every moment you're told you're lucky while you are quietly breaking. And Mariah has broken more than once, not because she was weak, but because she was human in a system that punishes humans for needing rest. There was a year when the public narrative turned cruel, when a highly visible career stumble became entertainment for strangers, and her exhaustion was treated like spectacle instead of a warning sign. There were years when her love life looked glamorous from a distance, yet inside it carried the old pattern she knows too well, a powerful man who could open doors also having the power to close them, safety slowly turning into suffocation. And the terrifying moment when you realize you have become a guest in your own life. There were seasons when she was celebrated for sounding effortless while privately fighting a mind that could swing between blinding energy and crushing heaviness, a condition she kept quiet about for years because the industry has no patience for vulnerability unless it can be packaged. And then there was the comeback, the kind people call inspiring but rarely understand. A comeback is not a magical return. It is a slow rebuilding of the self, boundary by boundary, decision by decision, learning to say no, learning to survive the quiet without panicking, learning to sing again without letting the world take your voice as payment. At 56, what hits hardest is not the catalog, not the awards, not the yearly ritual of her holiday anthem floating through malls and living rooms. What hits hardest is the image of a woman who has given the world so much sound, now being asked by life to endure the loudest kind of silence. The camera can catch her on stage in glitter and confidence, but it cannot capture the moments after, when she steps into a hallway alone and the noise fades, and she is once again the girl who learned early that love can leave, homes can shift, and safety can be temporary. This is why her story makes people cry when they finally look closely, because the real tragedy is not that she suffered. It is that she had to keep performing while suffering and still find a way to remain gentle enough to create joy for others. The question is not whether Mariah Carey can still hit the notes. The question is what it costs a person to keep singing when grief, pressure, and memory all demand that she go quiet, and why she refuses to disappear even when disappearing would be easier. Fame did not arrive gently in Mariah Carey's life. It detonated. One moment, she was a young woman navigating New York with demo tapes and borrowed confidence. And the next, she was the industry's newest miracle, a 5-octave phenomenon packaged as destiny. Her debut album did not merely succeed, it dominated. And with domination came a contract she did not consciously sign, but felt every day thereafter. You will not fail. Success in the early 1990s was not just about talent. It was about endurance. The machine that crowned her also demanded constant output, constant perfection, constant availability. There was no language in that system for fatigue. In interviews from that era, she often appeared luminous and composed, but behind that composure was a schedule that bordered on punishing. Studio sessions blurred into promotional tours, photo shoots into award shows, red carpets into rehearsals. The world heard range and power. Her body felt depletion. When you become the voice of a generation, you stop being treated like a person and start being treated like infrastructure. People depend on you to sound flawless. Labels depend on you to sell. Media depends on you to generate narrative. And if your voice wavers, even slightly, the whisper begins, is she over? By the time albums like Emotions and Music Box cemented her dominance, Mariah was not simply competing with peers. She was competing with her own myth. The higher she climbed, the narrower the margin for error became. Perfection was no longer a goal. It was a baseline. That pressure reshapes a psyche. When applause becomes oxygen, silence becomes suffocation. She once described feeling as though she lived inside glass, admired, visible, and yet constantly at risk of shattering. Then came a paradox that would follow her for decades. In 1994, she co-wrote and recorded All I Want for Christmas Is You, a song crafted in a burst of brightness that would later become one of the most commercially enduring singles in modern music history. Each year it resurfaces, climbing charts anew, generating millions in royalties, transforming December into a Mariah Carey season. On paper, it is one of the greatest business triumphs in pop history, a masterclass in ownership and catalog longevity. But emotionally, the contrast is striking. A woman whose life was often shadowed by instability created the most recognizable soundtrack to joy. This is the complexity of her career. The world associates her with celebration, yet so many of her defining experiences unfolded under intense isolation. She could fill arenas with warmth while privately wrestling with exhaustion. She could smile at holiday specials while feeling trapped inside expectations that never loosened. That duality, radiant public persona, turbulent private interior, became the defining tension of her adulthood. And then came the relationship that would alter the trajectory of her identity as much as her career. When she married Tommy Mottola, the powerful executive who had signed her to Columbia Records, the union looked like the ultimate fairy tale, the industry kingmaker and the young superstar he had helped elevate. From the outside, it symbolized stability and protection. From the inside, it became something far more complicated. Power imbalances are rarely loud at first. They are subtle. Decisions filtered through approval. Collaborators quietly selected or rejected. Boundaries disguised as care. Mariah would later describe feeling monitored, constrained, and creatively stifled, living in a mansion that resembled a sanctuary but felt increasingly like a controlled environment. It is one of the cruel ironies of her story. A woman who spent her childhood without stability found herself in a marriage that offered structure, yet at the cost of autonomy. Freedom, when she finally chose it, did not come without fear. Leaving meant stepping away from not only a husband, but a protective system that had shielded and shaped her career. The divorce, finalized in 1998, marked a turning point. Her music shifted. Albums like Butterfly carried a new tone, less polished compliance, more personal exploration. She was no longer singing solely to meet expectation. She was singing to reclaim narrative. But reclaiming narrative does not immunize you from collapse. As the millennium turned, so did public perception. In 2001, after signing a massive deal with Virgin Records, she released Glitter, a project that failed to meet commercial expectations and was quickly framed as catastrophe. Headlines were ruthless. The same media that once hailed her as untouchable now dissected her every misstep. What few acknowledged was the cumulative toll of a decade lived at maximum intensity. That year marked one of the darkest periods of her life. Sleep deprivation, relentless scrutiny, and untreated mental health struggles converged. Eventually, she was diagnosed with bipolar II disorder, a reality she kept private for years before revealing it publicly in 2018. At the time, however, the narrative was not compassionate. It was sensational. Her breakdown became content. Her vulnerability became spectacle. To understand the emotional weight of that period is to recognize the brutality of celebrity culture. There is little room for pause. A star could be celebrated one season and discarded the next. For Mariah, the collapse was not merely professional, it was existential. For the first time since her teenage years, she stopped singing. Silence, once her refuge, became terrifying. If her identity was her voice, who was she without it? Yet even in retreat, the instinct to create did not fully die. Healing came slowly, through treatment, through recalibration, through distance from the noise. And when she returned in 2005 with the emancipation of Mimi, it was not framed as survival, but as triumph. The album sold millions. We Belong Together dominated charts, and critics heralded her resurgence. But what truly mattered was not the sales figures. It was the shift in agency. This time, she moved differently, more deliberate, more self-aware. She had seen how quickly the industry could withdraw affection. She had felt how fragile public adoration truly is. So she began building something sturdier than applause. Ownership, boundaries, selective appearances, creative control. At 56, looking back on those years, the tears do not come from nostalgia. They come from recognition. Recognition of how much pressure one person carried. Recognition of how close she came to disappearing. Recognition that behind every flawless high note was a woman negotiating fear, autonomy, illness, and expectation all at once. The tragedy of Mariah Carey is not that she stumbled. It is that she was expected never to stumble at all. And the miracle is not that she returned to the top. It is that she returned to herself. What ultimately changed Mariah Carey was not applause, nor criticism, nor even the brutal volatility of the music industry. It was love, how it protected her, how it confined her, how it healed her, and how it failed her. If the first decade of her career was about survival inside a system, the second was about survival inside intimacy. And intimacy, for someone who grew up without stable ground, is never simple. Her marriage to Tommy Mottola was the first chapter where power and affection collided in a way that would define her sense of autonomy for years. On paper, it was a union that made sense. He was the head of Columbia Records, the architect of her breakthrough, the executive who recognized her commercial potential before the rest of the world caught up. He offered security, structure, and the validation that every ambitious young artist craves. But security has layers. What begins as guidance can become governance. What feels like protection can become surveillance. Mariah has described that period as living inside a gilded enclosure. Magnificent homes, controlled schedules, and a constant awareness of being watched. The mansion in Bedford, New York, became symbolic. Beautiful, expansive, but heavily monitored. Guards on the property. Visitors screened. Career decisions influenced, if not dictated. The more her public power expanded, the more her private independence narrowed. She once implied that she felt like a child bride, navigating a world where her personal choices were quietly overshadowed by corporate priorities. It is important to understand that emotional confinement does not always look violent. Sometimes it looks orderly. Sometimes it looks like someone else deciding what is best for you while convincing you it is love. For a woman whose childhood had been marked by chaos and instability, that kind of order could initially feel reassuring. Stability can be intoxicating when you've never had it. But over time, reassurance hardened into restriction. Creativity felt filtered. Spontaneity felt suspect. By the mid-1990s, she began reclaiming pieces of herself musically. The album Butterfly was not simply a stylistic pivot into R&B and hip-hop influences. It was a declaration. The metaphor was deliberate. Butterflies do not ask permission to emerge. They break through, and that process is not clean. It is violent in its own quiet way. When she left the marriage in 1997 and finalized the divorce in 1998, it marked the first major act of self-definition she had made as an adult. She walked away not only from a husband, but from a system that had framed her success. Freedom, however, is not the same as peace. After leaving, she entered a period of intense transition. Her public image shifted toward sensuality and experimentation. Collaborations expanded. She seemed more relaxed, more playful, more in control. But transitions are emotionally expensive. When you've been shaped by external authority for years, autonomy can feel disorienting. You are suddenly responsible for every choice, every misstep, every consequence. The early 2000s would test her again, but this time in love of a different kind. In 2008, she married Nick Cannon. The contrast to her first marriage was stark. He was younger, energetic, visibly affectionate. Their relationship radiated warmth and spontaneity. For many fans, it appeared that she had found balance, a partnership not rooted in hierarchy but companionship. With him, she laughed differently. She appeared lighter. The most profound shift during this chapter was motherhood. In 2011, she gave birth to twins, Monroe and Moroccan. The arrival of her children reoriented her priorities in a way no chart position ever could. Motherhood introduced a new vulnerability, but also a new anchor. For someone who had spent her life feeling unmoored, children provided a reason to build stability not for survival, but for legacy. Yet even gentle love can strain under pressure. Careers continued to demand attention. Public narratives continued to circulate. By 2014, the marriage began to fracture. Their separation and eventual divorce were notably less dramatic than media speculation might have predicted. They prioritized co-parenting, maintaining mutual respect publicly. This was not a catastrophic ending. It was a recognition of divergence. Sometimes love is real, but not sustainable in its original form. After that chapter closed, she entered another high-profile engagement with Australian businessman James Packer. The relationship was extravagant, intense, and fast-moving. Yachts, private jets, massive diamonds. Externally, it looked like the ultimate fairy tale encore. But once again, the glitter masked incompatibilities. The engagement ended in 2016. The symbolism was familiar. Opulence does not guarantee emotional safety. Then came a quieter, more understated relationship with Brian Tanaka, a longtime dancer and collaborator. Their bond felt less performative, more grounded in familiarity. For years, they maintained a relatively low-key presence compared to previous romances. But even that relationship eventually concluded, and by her mid-50s, Mariah's perspective on love had visibly shifted. She has expressed that she still believes in love, but not the kind that requires self-erasure. That distinction is critical. Early in her life, love was often intertwined with survival. As a child, she sought stability. As a young adult, she accepted protection that came with conditions. As a global star, she navigated admiration that blurred into control. Over time, she learned to distinguish between affection and autonomy. At 56, what makes her story particularly moving is not the number of relationships she has had, but the evolution within them. Each chapter softened her in different ways. Each inning forced a recalibration. She no longer seems desperate to prove anything through partnership. There is less urgency, more discernment. Loss, too, has reshaped her understanding of love. The deaths of her parents and sister brought unresolved history to the surface. Grief strips away illusions. It reminds you that love is finite in its physical form. For someone whose identity is built around voice, grief can feel like an internal muting. Yet, even in mourning, she continues to create, to perform selectively, to show up for her children. Perhaps the most powerful transformation in this phase of her life is her relationship with herself. The young woman who once accepted constraint in exchange for safety now insists on boundaries. The artist who once allowed exhaustion to accumulate unchecked now speaks openly about mental health. The public figure who once chased approval now curates her presence carefully. When people ask what happened to Mariah Carey at 56, they often expect decline or scandal. But the truth is subtler. What happened is maturation under pressure. What happened is a woman learning that survival is not enough, sustainability matters. What happened is a recalibration of love, from something that rescues or dazzles to something that listens. And perhaps that is the most emotional realization of all. Not that she lost love, but that she finally learned to protect herself within it. If the earlier chapters of Mariah Carey's life were defined by love, ambition, and reinvention, the next was defined by something far less visible but far more relentless: her own mind. Long before she publicly named it, she was living inside it. The world saw fluctuations in energy, moments of dazzling productivity followed by periods of withdrawal, but the explanation remained private. Behind flawless performances and carefully curated appearances, there was a battle unfolding that no chart position could silence. The year 2001 marked a rupture that went deeper than a failed film or a contract dispute. The exhaustion that had been accumulating for over a decade finally demanded attention. Mariah has since revealed that she was diagnosed with bipolar II disorder during that period, though she kept the diagnosis secret for many years. At the time, however, the public narrative was cruelly simplified. What should have been treated as a medical and psychological crisis became spectacle. Headlines reduced her pain to instability. Commentary mocked what was, in truth, a person overwhelmed beyond her threshold. Bipolar II disorder is not a dramatic caricature. It is not theatrical mania or cinematic breakdowns. It is subtle and destabilizing in quieter ways. Hypomanic episodes can feel productive, almost euphoric, an accelerated stream of ideas and energy that seems creative until it crosses into exhaustion. Depressive phases, by contrast, are suffocating, heavy, and isolating. For someone whose identity is built on performance and output, this cycle can be particularly punishing. When you are praised for your intensity during highs and shamed for your fragility during lows, the message becomes clear: hide the pattern. For years, she did. She performed through it. She recorded through it. She smiled through it. Medication was attempted, discontinued, adjusted. There were stretches when she avoided treatment because the stigma felt heavier than the symptoms. In an industry that markets perfection, admitting mental illness feels like admitting weakness. She later admitted she lived in denial for a long time, afraid of what the label would mean for her career. Imagine carrying that privately while being publicly dissected. Imagine standing on stage in front of thousands, delivering impossible notes with precision, while knowing that your internal stability is fragile. The contrast is staggering. The glittering gowns, the confident persona, the signature humor, these became armor. But armor is heavy. Over time, concealment became unsustainable. In 2018, she finally chose to speak openly about her diagnosis. It was not a dramatic confession. It was measured, deliberate, and grounded. She described years of fear, misinterpretation, and silence. That disclosure shifted her narrative. Suddenly, moments once framed as erratic were recontextualized as symptomatic. The diva stereotype dissolved into something more human. A woman managing a chronic condition while navigating one of the most demanding industries in the world. What makes this chapter especially moving is not the diagnosis itself, but the way she reframed it. She did not present herself as cured. She presented herself as aware. Awareness became her form of power. She began building routines that prioritized mental stability, structured schedules, vocal rest, therapy, medication adherence, fewer unnecessary appearances. She learned to identify early signs of imbalance and respond before they escalated. This level of discipline rarely receives applause. The public celebrates grand comebacks, not quiet maintenance. Yet maintenance is what sustains longevity. At 56, her life appears more curated, not because she lacks opportunity, but because she has learned the cost of overexposure. There are fewer chaotic tours, fewer reckless commitments. She selects projects carefully. She protects her calendar. She guards her energy. Mental health has also reshaped how she defines success. In her 20s and 30s, success was expansion. More records sold, more stages conquered, more accolades secured. In midlife, success has become preservation. Preserving her voice, preserving her peace, preserving her role as a mother. She structures tours and holiday residencies around her twins. She ensures she is present for milestones. That recalibration is not decline. It is intentional evolution. Financially, she remains formidable. With an estimated net worth around $350 million and a catalog that continues generating significant annual royalties, particularly from All I Want for Christmas Is You, she occupies a rare space where legacy translates into recurring economic power. But wealth does not neutralize vulnerability. Money can buy privacy, security, and flexibility, but it cannot erase bipolar disorder or grief. What it can do is provide choice, the ability to step back without financial ruin, the ability to prioritize health without losing everything. Another layer of this chapter involves aging. The entertainment industry is notoriously unkind to women over 40, especially those who once defined youth and glamour. Public scrutiny of her appearance, body, and energy has never fully ceased. Yet aging has also granted her a new kind of detachment. She no longer chases every room's approval. She understands the cyclical nature of relevance. Trends change, cultural memory shifts, but catalog and character endure. In recent years, her performances carry a different tone. There is less urgency to prove technical supremacy, more emphasis on connection, more softness in her demeanor. It feels as though she is no longer racing against an invisible clock. She knows what she has achieved. She knows what she survived. At 56, what happened to Mariah Carey is not tragedy in the conventional sense. It is confrontation with illness, with mortality, with public misunderstanding, with the reality that brilliance does not exempt you from fragility. And perhaps the most powerful shift is this. She no longer pretends otherwise. Her voice remains iconic, but the deeper resonance now lies in her transparency. She has allowed the world to see that strength is not the absence of instability. It is the willingness to remain present despite it. She is not invincible. She is managing. She is adjusting. She is still here. And sometimes, in a culture that consumes and discards celebrities with ruthless speed, the most radical achievement is simple endurance. By the time Mariah Carey entered her 50s, something fundamental had shifted. The hunger that once drove her toward every stage, every microphone, every opportunity began to soften. Not because she had lost ambition, but because she had finally gained perspective. There's a difference between chasing success and owning it. In her earlier years, success felt like something fragile, something that could vanish if she did not grip it tightly enough. In midlife, success became infrastructure, catalog ownership, publishing rights, long-term royalties, brand control. The girl who once worried about eviction was now architecting financial permanence. Nothing symbolizes that permanence more than All I Want for Christmas Is You. What began in 1994 as a bright, deceptively simple holiday song has evolved into a cultural institution. Each December, it resurfaces organically, climbing global charts and dominating streaming platforms. Industry analysts regularly estimate that the song generates several $1 million annually in royalties alone. But beyond the revenue, it represents strategic foresight. Mariah retained significant ownership of her catalog, meaning that the song's resurgence benefits her directly. That kind of financial autonomy is rare in pop music, especially for women who debuted in the early 1990s. Ownership changed her relationship with work. She no longer needed to say yes to everything. She could select holiday residencies, curated performances, limited tours, events designed for sustainability rather than exhaustion. Her Las Vegas residency, for example, demonstrated how legacy artists can monetize catalog strength without sacrificing health. The format allowed stability, reduced travel strain, and maintained high production value. It was not about proving relevance. It was about refining presence. But financial success alone does not quiet emotional evolution. At 56, Mariah's life appears less chaotic, more intentional. She invests in privacy. Homes are not trophies, but fortresses, spaces where she can decompress without intrusion. Real estate in New York, Los Angeles, and past island retreats reflect a need for environmental control. For someone who grew up in instability and later felt confined within monitored spaces, choosing her own sanctuary carries psychological weight. Safety is no longer something negotiated, it is curated. Motherhood remains her central anchor. Monroe and Moroccan are no longer toddlers, but adolescents, and that transition has reshaped her daily rhythm. She structures commitments around their schedules, their emotional needs, their milestones. Fame is now secondary to presence. There is something profoundly moving about watching a woman once defined by spectacle prioritize quiet domestic moments. She often refers to her children as her greatest accomplishments. That phrasing is not rhetorical. It reflects a recalibrated value system. In interviews, her tone carries a new steadiness. There is humor, yes, and still flashes of theatrical flair, but beneath it lies calm awareness. She speaks openly about mental health management. She acknowledges aging without denial. She accepts that some performances will be stronger than others. That humility contrasts sharply with the rigid perfectionism of her early career. It is not resignation. It is sustainability. Another subtle transformation involves her public boundaries. She engages with social media selectively. She avoids unnecessary controversy. She rarely overshares romantic developments. Relationships no longer define her narrative arc. Love, in her current worldview, must coexist with autonomy. The days of sacrificing identity for stability appear firmly behind her. Grief has also reshaped her. The loss of her mother and sister in close succession was not merely a personal tragedy. It was a symbolic severing of origin. Her mother had been her first musical influence, her first technical guide. Their relationship was complex, filled with admiration, friction, intensity, but foundational. Losing that anchor forces reflection. What remains when the person who taught you how to breathe through fear is no longer there? In the aftermath, she withdrew publicly for a period. There were fewer appearances, fewer statements. Those who observed closely noticed a different quality in her performances upon return. Softer, more introspective. It was as if grief had altered her phrasing, not weakening it but deepening it. Loss refines tone. It strips away performative urgency and leaves only essence. Financially, emotionally, and artistically, Mariah, at 56, is no longer fighting for legitimacy. She has secured it. What she protects now is equilibrium. That is perhaps the most significant evolution of all. Early Mariah equated survival with output. Current Mariah equates survival with balance. She understands that mental stability requires deliberate structure, that her voice requires rest, that her presence in her children's lives outweighs the adrenaline of constant touring. And yet, she remains culturally powerful. Each holiday season proves that relevance can be cyclical rather than constant. Each memoir, excerpt, and selective interview reminds audiences that vulnerability strengthens legacy rather than diminishes it. She has shaped her narrative with increasing precision, correcting misconceptions without indulging in bitterness. At 56, what happened to Mariah Carey is not decline. It is distillation. The chaos has been filtered. The noise has been reduced. What remains is the core, a voice forged in adversity, refined by autonomy, and sustained by conscious choice. She no longer performs for survival. She performs because she chooses to. That distinction between necessity and choice is the quiet triumph of this chapter. By the time Mariah Carey reached her mid-50s, the most intense battles of her life were no longer public spectacles. They were internal recalibrations. There is something profoundly different about surviving your own history and then choosing how to carry it. At 56, she is not defined by chart positions, not by headlines, not even by her vocal range. She is defined by endurance, emotional, psychological, and spiritual endurance that has outlasted every cycle of praise and backlash. The entertainment industry rarely allows women to age without commentary. Youth is commodified. Reinvention is demanded. Nostalgia is monetized. And for someone who became famous so young, whose image was once inseparable from glamour and technical perfection, the transition into midlife could have been destabilizing. Instead, it appears to have clarified her priorities. She does not chase relevance through spectacle anymore. She leverages legacy. That difference is subtle but powerful. Each December, the ritual repeats. All I Want for Christmas Is You climbs charts worldwide as if it were newly released. The cultural phenomenon is almost surreal, an artist whose seasonal resurgence rivals contemporary pop stars. Yet there is a calmness in how she approaches it now. She understands the economics. She understands the cultural imprint. But she no longer appears frantic to prove dominance. The song's annual return feels less like a comeback and more like a tradition, stable, expected, controlled. Control has become central to her current life. After decades of fluctuating public narratives, mental health challenges, and relationship complexities, she has built a lifestyle around boundaries. Performances are selective. Appearances are strategic. She does not oversaturate herself in media cycles. There's intention in her pacing. For someone who once burned through energy at unsustainable speeds, that measured rhythm is a victory. Her mental health management remains ongoing. Bipolar II disorder does not disappear with success. It requires maintenance, awareness, and discipline. She has spoken about learning to recognize early warning signs, sleep disruption, racing thoughts, mood shifts, and intervening before they spiral. That self-awareness may be the most important skill she has developed. It represents maturity that no award ceremony can measure. At 56, Mariah Carey is not invulnerable. There are still days when grief feels fresh. The loss of her mother and sister did not resolve neatly with time. Grief is nonlinear. It resurfaces in unexpected ways, during rehearsals, in certain keys, in quiet rooms where memory is louder than sound. But she has integrated that grief rather than allowing it to consume her. She continues to perform, to write, to parent, not out of denial, but out of acceptance that life continues even when it feels fractured. Motherhood has anchored her more deeply than any contract ever could. Monroe and Moroccan are now old enough to perceive her not just as a star, but as a person. That awareness changes everything. Children see beyond performance. They notice mood shifts, fatigue, emotional strain. Being present for them requires authenticity. She cannot simply play stability at home. She must practice it. That practice, consistent routines, emotional availability, physical presence, has reshaped her sense of responsibility. There's also a noticeable shift in how she engages with admiration. Earlier in her career, applause was validation. In midlife, admiration seems secondary to peace. She has reached a point where legacy is secure. The anxiety of proving worth has softened. That softening is visible in interviews, less defensive, more reflective. She speaks about her past with clarity, not with denial or exaggerated nostalgia. Financial security has allowed her to prioritize health over hustle. With an estimated net worth in the hundreds of millions, bolstered by catalog ownership and long-term royalties, she possesses something many artists never achieve: autonomy. Autonomy to rest. Autonomy to withdraw temporarily. Autonomy to protect her voice and mind without risking collapse. Money does not cure grief or bipolar disorder, but it does provide the freedom to manage them privately. Perhaps the most emotional realization about Mariah Carey at 56 is that she has outlived the narrative arcs that once threatened to define her. She outlived the controlling marriage. She outlived the public breakdown headlines. She outlived the industry whispers that she was finished. She even outlived the version of herself that believed exhaustion was necessary for greatness. Now, greatness looks different. It looks like sustainability. It looks like showing up for her children's milestones. It looks like choosing a limited tour schedule instead of a grueling world circuit. It looks like singing when she wants to sing, not because she is contractually obligated to. When people say, "Try not to cry when you see this," they often expect visible tragedy. But the real emotional weight of her story lies in something quieter. It lies in the image of a woman who has survived control, collapse, illness, grief, and scrutiny, and is still standing, not perfectly, but deliberately. She does not need to be the loudest voice in the room anymore. She only needs to remain present in her own life. And at 56, that may be her most remarkable achievement. At 56, Mariah Carey does not stand at the center of a fairy tale. She stands at the center of something far more difficult and far more human, a life that refused to collapse, even when collapse seemed inevitable. The tears people feel when they look at her now are not just about nostalgia. They're about recognition. Recognition of how much one person can endure while still offering beauty to the world. When she steps onto a stage today, the applause carries decades inside it. It carries the cold apartments of her childhood, the racial hostility her family endured, the broken marriage that looked like salvation but felt like confinement, the public unraveling that became tabloid sport, the quiet diagnosis she hid for years, the love she tried to rebuild more than once, and the devastating losses that arrived long after the world assumed she had already survived enough. Every note she sings now is layered with that history. What makes this chapter emotional is not decline. It is depth. The girl who once sang to survive is now a woman who sings to remember. There is something softer in her phrasing, something less desperate and more deliberate. She no longer performs as though she is fighting for legitimacy. She performs as someone who knows exactly what it costs to remain standing. Grief has a way of rearranging perspective. Losing her mother meant losing the first voice that ever corrected her pitch, the first hands that guided her breathing, the first person who believed she was extraordinary before the industry confirmed it. Losing her sister meant confronting a complicated bond that never fully healed but never fully disappeared either. These are not losses you compartmentalize easily. They echo, and yet she continues to sing. That is what moves people. The entertainment industry rarely allows its icons to age with dignity. It either freezes them in youth or critiques them for no longer embodying it. Mariah has lived through both extremes. She has been idolized, mocked, celebrated, dismissed, resurrected, and rebranded more times than most artists survive. Through it all, her voice remained the one constant thread. Not flawless at every moment, not immune to strain, but unmistakably hers. And perhaps that is the most powerful truth at 56. She no longer needs to prove perfection. She has shifted from performance to preservation. Preservation of her health. Preservation of her peace. Preservation of her relationship with her children. Monroe and Moroccan represent continuity. They're the life she built after instability, the family she consciously constructed rather than inherited. When she looks at them, she sees something she never had consistently growing up: predictable love. Financial success has given her autonomy, but it has not insulated her from pain. Money can create gates and security systems, but it cannot silence intrusive thoughts or erase grief. What it has given her is choice, the ability to step back when necessary, to structure her schedule around her mental health, to curate her public presence rather than be consumed by it. For an artist who once felt trapped inside both a marriage and an industry, that autonomy is monumental. If you watch her carefully now, you see a woman who understands silence differently. Silence once represented fear of being forgotten, of failing, of losing momentum. Today, silence is rest. It is boundary. It is the space where she recalibrates rather than collapses. That evolution is not glamorous, but it is extraordinary. When people ask what happened to Mariah Carey at 56, they expect a scandal, a downfall, or a dramatic reinvention. The real answer is quieter. What happened is that she endured. She endured childhood instability. She endured public scrutiny. She endured mental illness without surrendering her identity. She endured heartbreak without abandoning the belief in love. She endured grief without abandoning her voice. There's something almost defiant about that kind of longevity. In a culture that consumes and discards, she remains. Not because she clings desperately to relevance, but because she has built a life that does not depend entirely on it. Her legacy is secure. Her catalog is immortalized. Her story is documented. What remains is the person beneath the myth. And that person, at 56, is not the ingenue of the early 90s or the caricature critics once painted. She is a mother, an artist, a survivor managing a chronic condition, a woman who has learned that strength is not about never breaking, but about rebuilding with intention. When the lights dim after a show and the applause fades into memory, she walks off stage not as a symbol, but as someone who has chosen, again and again, to stay, to keep singing, to keep loving, to keep breathing through whatever comes next. That is why her story makes people cry. Not because it is tragic, but because it is resilient. And resilience, especially when it is quiet and hard-earned, is one of the most beautiful sounds a human life can make.